It's Wednesday, July 20th. From inside the WTOP newsroom, this is the DMV Download, brought to you by the men and women of Steamfitters Local 602. Get an estimate and learn more at steamfitters-602.org. Today, we take time to understand how recycling actually works in the DC region. What happens to that bottle that you toss into the blue bin at home or in a coffee shop? Are our efforts to reduce waste in DC actually doing anything? For answers, I talked to local recycling guru Charlotte Dreizen.
I think one of the really problematic narratives we've had in recycling in recent years is that it's easy, recycle. And it's not easy. It is a really hard thing to understand.
I also talked to Charlotte about how the status quo of recycling here in the DC region isn't enough, and what's really at stake if we don't fix it.
Frankly, when we direct trash to landfills and waste to energy, it leaches into our water system, it contributes to air pollution, and that's not anything anyone wants.
Thanks for joining me. I'm Luke Garrett. Megan is off today. So where does recycling stand for us here in the DMV? And how can we continue to reduce and reuse when large-scale recycling systems are kind of out of control? To help us answer that question, I'm joined by Charlotte Dreizen. She's currently the sustainability manager for the American Institute of Architects, and she previously worked in the DC government's waste and public works agencies. We also know Charlotte from Twitter, where she's kind of a recycling guru. Charlotte, thanks for being here.
So delighted to be here with you. Thanks so much, Luke.
So Charlotte, before we get into the nitty-gritty of DMV recycling, let's talk about, recycling in general and whether it's still worth it. Back in 2018, we saw a major shakeup in the recycling industry when there was a Chinese import ban, and a lot of people didn't know what to do with all the recycling that they had collected. And this made people question whether recycling was still worth it because people weren't taking it. So just to review here, what happened 4 years ago, and what's its effect been on DC recycling?
Yeah, it's a great question. And rewinding back to 2018 when the China import ban first started, it definitely had a massive acute shock on the recycling system. There's a couple of nuances there that are important to keep in mind. One is that the majority of the impact was to the West Coast. So, recycling, you have to transport long distances and that adds cost. So it was never really efficient for us on the East Coast, like here in Washington, D.C., to ship materials to the West Coast and then to import them all the way to China. So when that acute shock happened in 2018, it was really damaging for a lot of the country, but certainly not all of the country. And it was absolutely the case that for many months in 2018, it was really a struggle to find recycling markets to send recyclables. And a lot of communities did have to landfill them or burn them in waste to energy facilities, not having anywhere to put them, not having anywhere to send them for folks to buy. The US recycling market has really expanded since then, though. And for a lot of places like DC, where we've generally always had domestic markets for our materials, the impact there is that it's increased our costs. So, now that there is much more domestic supply, we're not exporting as much material as we used to. We still have a lot of really high quality domestic markets, but there's a lot more supply and, increasing demand, but not increasing quite so fast. So the revenue we can get for our recyclables has definitely diminished a little bit just from a kind of a city's perspective. But certainly within the year, a lot of the markets rebounded. And instead of sending material to China, a lot of the West Coast continues to export recyclables, but they export it to other communities and countries in Southeast Asia. So definitely the market recovered pretty quickly. And I think one of the really unfortunate damaging impacts of China's import ban in 2018, that, for good reason, people were concerned for, a handful of months. The market did recover within the year, though, by and large. So a lot of that kind of residual anxiety and concern remains. And a lot of folks, I totally get why they're concerned about where their recyclables are going, but it's safe to say that almost all recyclables that, have high quality end markets are being channeled to markets, in the US or elsewhere today. And there, that same concern about materials not having a place to go at all isn't really the case today.
Got it. So recycling now definitely works. And just to back up here for a second, this whole kind of recycling market boils down to me, drinking a kombucha, putting that glass bottle in, the recycling bin, public works picking that up and then taking it somewhere and then some private industry then selling it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So some cities have their own recycling facilities. Other cities like ours hire out through, a third party to do that work for us. So here in DC, you're exactly right. If you put a glass kombucha bottle into your blue bin, DPW, the Department of Public Works, is going to come pick it up if you're in a single family home. If you're in a multifamily building, a private hauler will come and do that. They're going to take it to what we call a transfer station. And that's where all of the recycling and trash gets aggregated into massive mountains, many stories high sometimes. And then it gets shipped to what we call a MRF.
A MRF.
Pronounced like Smurf, but without the S, a MRF.
Got it.
And that stands for Material Recovery Facility. And that's where everything gets sorted. Then from there, you're exactly right. It's going to be sold as a commodity on the private market to folks within the US and sometimes outside of the US. But again, DC, for the most part, has domestic markets. So we have a huge, really strong paper industry in Virginia, for instance. So most of our paper stays really pretty close to home in Virginia. For many of our plastics, they get recycled in the Southeast, some in the Northeast in New Jersey, and certainly some gets exported, but it's a pretty small amount as a whole. But you're exactly right. The private sector plays a really important role in DC's recycling system from the get-go, right from collection. If you're at a business or a multifamily building, but no matter who's picking it up, once it's collected, it's going to go to a private facility to be sorted.
Got it. And so going back to that second where I'm throwing things in the recycling bin, I've been scrolling through your Twitter and learned a lot about, how to best do that. And one thing that stands out is glass recycling versus plastic recycling. What's going on with these two materials specifically in DC? How do we treat those two?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question because they are two very different materials that are handled really differently. They have very different end of life stories today. So one of the big issues in recycling in the US nationally for many years is that glass has had an increasingly difficult time being recycled. And I think this is one of the things that's kind of contrary to all of our day-to-day interactions. We know and love glass. Glass is, we know, an infinitely recyclable material, really high quality. But one of the challenges with collecting it in a single stream recycling system like ours, where we put all sorts of recyclables in the same bin and then they get sorted at a facility on the back end, is that glass ends up being very contaminated. So one of the rules of thumbs that we talk about in recycling is that you can't recycle anything under 2 inches by 2 inches. If it's smaller than the size of a Post-it, you really can't recycle it in the curbside system. And the reason is because it contaminates the glass. So when you put glass into a recycling facility, it's going to get knocked around, it's going to break. So the recycling system is designed to catch all of those small glass pieces. And they basically are designed to think that all small items are glass, which is great when we have a really high quality recycling stream. But unfortunately, we have a lot of contamination today. So when people put keys or wine corks or coins or bits of paper and plastic that are small into the recycling system, it ends up getting into the glass. And the end result is that we have really dirty glass. If you look at one of our recycling facilities, a big tractor scoop of our broken glass, you could barely tell what commodity it is because there's so much plastic film and paper swimming amongst in it. So frankly, it's too low quality to take it to a glass manufacturer and for them to put it back into glass bottles. So one of those problems with glass recycling is that quality piece. And for that reason, a lot of communities in the US, like Kansas City, and now as of a couple of years ago, many communities in Northern Virginia have dedicated glass drop-off points where people can bring their glass bottles, wine bottles, jars, you name it, and collect it in a source separated way. So it's really perfectly clean. They have almost no contamination. And because it's so clean when it's collected on its own, they can bring it to a glass manufacturer to put it back into glass bottles and really recycle it. But in DC, we haven't yet set up those systems. Hopefully that's something that's not so far away in the future, but we don't have them today.
And so the question that pops into my head is, what happens with this glass we put into our recycling that then shatters and becomes smaller than a Post-it note? Is it, still worth putting in the recycling, or do they have some other use for it?
What does happen today with our glass that you put into a blue bin in DC is that it gets used as what we call alternative daily cover. And that basically means a layer of inert material that folks at landfills layer on top of all of our normal trash every day. And the point of that is to really try and prevent methane emissions. So when you have trash that's chock full of food waste and yard waste and lots of organic materials, it breaks down and releases methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas, basically the most potent greenhouse gas out there. So alternative daily cover, layering on this inert material like concrete or aggregate or glass in our case, is a way to try and prevent that. It doesn't work great. It is not the highest and best use for glass, but it is doing something to try and make landfill disposal more sustainable. So certainly we want to change the system and ensure that glass that's recycled gets to its highest and best use. But today it unfortunately does go to alternative daily cover in landfills.
So what about plastic? Is that any better than recycling glass in the DC area?
Plastic, on the other side, we have really strong end markets for. So in DC, we can recycle a few different kinds of plastic resins, which is the majority of plastic containers that you see on store shelves and that you probably have in your home. So we can recycle number one, plastic, PET, polyethylene terephthalate, like soda bottles. And you can recycle number two, plastic high density polyethylene like milk jugs. You can recycle low density polyethylene number four containers that are, some of the takeout containers or a big quart container you might get from the deli, as well as number five, which is what we see in yogurt containers, polypropylene. And that makes up the majority of plastic containers that you're going to see out on the market. So DC can accept the vast majority of the plastic we might be interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And what happens when we get to the recycling facility is they use what we call near infrared optical sorters. They send a light beam down onto the conveyor belt, and then based on the kind of plastic it is, it'll bounce back and tell the machine, is this a yogurt cup? Is this a soda bottle? Is it a milk jug? And then it sorts it into its own separate bales. And we have really strong end markets for those materials. We do in DC accept a last kind of plastic called polystyrene. Many folks might be familiar with, polystyrene foam, styrofoam. It's the same kind of plastic, but it's condensed. So it's not puffed up with air into a foam format. It's the most common kind of material you might see on a coffee cup lid, for instance, and that is accepted for recycling in DC, but it has a really low value in the end market. So it's something that, in my opinion, we should regulate out. We just shouldn't have it in the first place because we're never going to have a really robust end market for it. But exactly as you said, for plastic that we have in our day-to-day lives, most plastic containers can be recycled in DC and can be sorted really effectively, and we have very strong domestic end markets for them.
Got it. So if it's plastic, throw it in the recycling bin. If it's a salsa container, maybe turn it into a cup or something if it's glass.
A great idea.
And after the break, we talk about why recycling in DC actually matters and what will happen if improvements aren't made to the recycling system.
Backed by the experience of its hardworking members, Steamfitters Local 602 is ready to take on your next commercial, heating, cooling, HVAC, or refrigeration project. Steamfitters Local 602 adds value to our community through its partnerships with local contractors and building owners, all while keeping the focus on improving the lives of its members and their families throughout the DMV. For work that's on time and on budget, go to steamfitters-602.org to schedule your next project. That's steamfitters-602.org. Steamfitters Local 602, changing lives.
Thanks for listening to the DMV Download. If you like the podcast, head to our show page, give us a rating, and leave a review.
We read all of them and use as suggestions to improve this show that we're so proud of. It also helps other listeners find this, our region's only local daily news podcast.
Thanks for making us a part of your day. Returning back now to our conversation with recycling guru Charlotte Dreizen. Charlotte, I want to ask you, you are on Twitter, very active, posting content most days about how to best recycle. And I'm just curious, what do people ask you about the most?
I would say the most common question I get is about where things go, exactly like your last couple of questions. The other side of questions that I most commonly get are about the edge cases. So, kind of the fringe items that we all have in our lives and whether they can or can't be recycled. And one of the most helpful things I think to think about when it comes to recycling in DC or wherever you are in the country is that the recycling system was designed to handle really basic packaging: paper, cardboard boxes, cartons, plastic containers, and metal containers. Anything else is really not designed to be accommodated by the curbside recycling system. And that's where we get into a lot of the contamination that we see. So a lot of people will tweet and say, can I recycle this car seat? Can I recycle this golf club? What about my window blinds? How about, you name it, my child's blow up pool in our backyard. And for all of those items, the answer is unfortunately, usually we can't recycle those because they're too big, too wonky, too massive and heavy. Something like a printer might have batteries or electronic components that we can't accept. So I think a lot of folks really well-intentionedly want to understand if they can recycle things beyond those basics. But unfortunately, the answer is often, we can't accept that in the curbside recycling system. And certainly, if I can give one piece of advice to those who are just starting to recycle and maybe lean into it, is do not recycle anything in a plastic bag. It is by and large the biggest source of contamination we have in our system, and it jams the recycling equipment. So we have to shut down the facility multiple times a day for workers to go in with box cutters and cut out those plastic bags. So if you're going to recycle, please do it without a plastic bag.
And, so obviously we're talking about recycling here, but what's the ultimate goal here? What's really the force pushing, the city to prioritize this, private companies prioritizing this, and us as individual citizens on Earth, trying to do this? What's the goal?
Yeah, such a great question. I think ultimately the goal is zero waste. So diverting the majority of material that we all generate from landfill. And most folks consider that to be 80% diversion. Very few people consider think it's feasible to divert 100% of everything we generate. And it's for that reason that a lot of materials are really complex combinations of paper and plastic and metal, or metal and batteries, that are really hard for machines to take apart and sort effectively. But we also want to be using less and reducing where we can is kind of the top priority in the waste hierarchy. And I think that it's been such a priority for not only cities like DC that has decided to have a zero waste goal, but also companies, due to all of the pressure that residents like us put on local governments and on companies. So it's definitely something that has hugely started to accelerate in the last handful of years, which is really exciting to see.
Yeah, you sound like surprisingly hopeful about it all. Like, honestly, is that a good assessment? Is there like hope that kind of a cleaner future is on the horizon?
Yeah, I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic for sure. I think one of the awesome things about waste and recycling is that we have demonstrated there are communities, cities, states, and countries that just don't happen to be the US that have achieved that level of waste diversion. So there are some countries in Europe, Belgium and Germany are the highest performing, that divert more than 80% of the waste they produce, which is awesome. That is, it really demonstrates that it's possible. And it's just a matter of how we get there and the policies and incentives and bans on items that can't be recycled to ensure we can make that reality happen.
And are there any specific, systems, incentives, or policies in DC, Maryland, or Virginia that are worth keeping our eye on?
One of the really exciting things that has been evolving recently is a bigger emphasis on multifamily recycling and recycling in businesses. So DC is one of the few cities that has what we call a universal list of recyclables. So no matter if you're a person, a business, a multifamily building, you are required to recycle, and you're required to recycle the same list of things. But unfortunately, that doesn't always play out in reality. We haven't really enforced those requirements for multifamily buildings and businesses, and they generate 90% of the waste that's produced in DC. Single family homes only generate about 10 to 12%. It's a really small minority. So we can't get to zero waste without that full participation of the commercial sector with businesses and multifamily buildings. And the Department of Public Works has been really active the past year or so, developing new resources and programs for multifamily buildings to understand what the requirements are and to, have that carrot of incentives with resources and toolkits and reusable bags people can use, but also the stick of enforcement and starting to really crack down and say, you have to provide your residents with recycling access. You can't skate by just giving them a trash chute anymore, which is some really exciting movement. But I think there's a lot of room to improve in terms of giving people proactive incentives, since as a whole, we've done a pretty good job giving access to folks, but we definitely haven't been giving them incentives to necessarily participate as, to a high of a level as they could.
So Charlotte, obviously you are very interested in the idea and the work of recycling, but it's really complicated. I mean, to understand all of what you've been explaining to us kind of requires a 20-minute podcast, and that's why we're doing it. But for a lot of people, when they are, consuming, eating, doing anything, and then, putting things in the trash, there's a high level of convenience of not having to think about it, just consuming, making trash, then throwing away. Done. What would you say to a listener who really is kind of uninspired by this whole recycling deal?
I think one of the really problematic narratives we've had in recycling in recent years is that it's easy, recycle. And it's not easy. It is a really hard thing to understand. And you're exactly right. If you aren't spending a lot of your time thinking about this, you won't know the ins and outs. So I think really boiling it down to the basics of recycle your bottles, your paper, your cardboard, your cans, and your cartons. And beyond that, don't worry about it. There's some fringe items that we can accept beyond that. Certainly, we want to get to zero waste and go from good to great. But the most important thing in my opinion, is for progress to not be the enemy of perfect. Perfect to not be the enemy of progress, I should say. But frankly, when we direct trash to landfills and waste to energy, it leaches into our water system. It contributes to air pollution. And that's not anything anyone wants. And it's just really removed. If you live in DC proper, we don't have a lot of waste processing within the city. We ship it out to Maryland and Virginia. And unfortunately, it negatively impacts the health and well-being of those communities, which are often communities of color. And it's a really big environmental justice issue that I don't think is often considered from that lens. So certainly, I totally get that a lot of folks are not interested in using a reusable coffee cup and always remembering to bring their reusable bag to the store and recycling everything to the nth degree. But really thinking about boiling it down to those basics, I think, is a good place to start.
Recycling guru Charlotte, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Luke.
And before we go, this topic of recycling is really tied up in a broader, bigger topic of climate change and the environment at large. And just this week, it's looking like we're going to pass the 100-degree mark, or at least that's what's forecasted. And this would be the first time we get into triple-digit degrees in nearly 6 years. The last time we did that was way back in August of 2016. And DC has activated its heat emergency plan as of 3 p.m. today. And as a part of this, really emergency order, there are cooling stations that are open across the district. So, if your AC is broken, if you don't have a cool place to be, you can head to these cooling centers where you can really seek refuge. Doctors are really saying that if you are in heat for extended periods of time, your body really struggles with regulating that. So keep an eye out on yourself and your loved ones as we enter this first real heat wave of the summer. And that does it for us today on the DMV Download. We're brought to you by Steamfitters Local 602. Rosie Hughes helped produce this show. Our managing editor is Craig Schwab, and our music is by Real World. Give us a review and rate our show if you get the chance, and follow us on social media where we post content every day from behind the scenes. You can find out more about this podcast and become one of our VIP listeners at dmvdownload.com. The DMV Download is a product of WTOP News. Listen on 103.5 FM in DC, 107.7 in Virginia, 103.9 FM in Frederick, Maryland, online at WTOP.com, and on the WTOP News app. Stay cool, have a good one, and see you tomorrow.